Hey, what's up YouTube? Dan the Fix-It Man. Got another quick video here for you. I'm going to show you how to change your rear brake pads and your rear brake rotors on a 2020 Toyota Highlander, and this does have the electronic parking brake. Now normally the first thing I do is push this caliper piston back in, making room for the new thicker pad material and of course the thicker rotors. So we usually take a look at the master cylinder to make sure that there's enough room in there so that when we push this back we're not going to overflow and make a big mess. Now in this case we cannot push this caliper piston back in until we retract the mechanism that is controlled by this electronic motor or the electronic parking brake. There's a few ways to do that. You can disconnect it here and apply voltage to this motor to spin it backwards and then push it in, or you can put the rear parking brake into service mode. A lot of vehicles, including Toyota, will have a special secret code. Press the button down 3 times or up 3 times, something like that. I'm not exactly sure what the process is. You have to have the driver's door open when you're doing that process, or many scan tools will also put the car into service mode. The way that seems to be the easiest and what I've been doing lately is just disconnecting the motor by taking out these 2 little Allen head bolts and then just wind that screw in manually, and that's what I'm going to do here. Now you also want to make sure that the car is turned off. Now the first thing I'm going to do is disconnect the parking brake motor right here. I'm just going to push down on this little clip and pull this connector off. And tuck that out of the way. Now you can take the caliper off for this next step, or you can just leave it on. I like to leave it on because I like to use the pry bar method of pushing that caliper piston back in once we do have the motor off and the mechanism wound back. I'm just going to use this little hex key. This is a 5mm Allen. Now we can just pull off this electric motor. There's a little O-ring that sometimes holds on, but there we go. Okay, now if you look closely at this electric motor, you'll see the male side or the shaft side of this motor is like a spline drive. It looks very similar to a triple square. This is a triple square bit that I have. It happens to be an 8mm. It's the closest one I could find, but if I put it in here, it still feels a little loose. There's just a little too much play. This would probably work because this is not a high torque application. We're just going to spin that in. But if you have a Torx bit, this one is a T45. This actually fit a lot better, and that's what I'm going to use. Just put it in here into the back, and then we'll just turn that in until you feel it stop. That's it. Okay, now we've got the mechanism wound all the way back in. Now we can push this caliper piston back in as we normally would. But that is going to push our brake fluid back up this line into the master cylinder. And so we need to make sure that we have enough room in there so that we're not going to overflow that and make a mess. Now, as an alternate method, you could take off this little rubber cap and crack open that bleeder screw so that as you push the caliper piston back in, it will push the old fluid out through that bleeder. But you do run the risk of introducing air into the lines or air into your system. And so you might have to bleed your brakes once you're done. The way that I'm doing it, I'm not opening up the system, and so we're not going to have to bleed the brakes when we're done. But let's go take a look at the master cylinder. Now you can see this is definitely overfilled. It's well above the max line. What's happened is as this person has taken their vehicle in for service and they top off all their fluids, as the brake pads wear down and this level drops, they keep adding brake fluid. So what we need to do is take that fluid out, and that's where opening that bleeder screw might be a better option here. But what I'm going to do is take the cap off and remove some of the fluid so that when we push this in, it's not going to overflow or make any messes. Normally if this was lower, maybe around the middle, I wouldn't even bother taking the cap off. You can push that caliper piston back in. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, meaning that it absorbs moisture, even the moisture in the air. So the less you can expose that to air, the better. In our case, we do need to open it up and suck out some of this fluid. So let's do that. I'm just going to use this little fluid extractor. All right, now you can see we're at least below the max line. I can remove a little bit more if needed, but now we can go push that caliper piston back in, knowing that this is not going to overflow and make a big mess. You could take off this caliper and use a little caliper pushback tool or wind back tool. I'm just going to use this little pry bar. This is from Mayhew, a little demo driver. Now I'm just prying this on the outside of the pad up against the body of this little caliper, and then just going to pull that towards me. Now I'm going to shift the pry bar in between the inside pad and the rotor just to make sure that that caliper piston is pushed all the way in. That feels good. You see, now we've got plenty of room in there. All right, now we need to loosen and remove these 2 caliper slide pin bolts. That's a 14mm socket. Now sometimes the slide pin will want to spin while you're removing these. If you need to, you can grab a 17mm open-end wrench and put it on that slide pin. That will hold it steady while you loosen it the rest of the way and take it out. See, it does want to spin, but that wrench holds it in place. You can see that that did have a little bit of thread locker on it. Right now we're going to take off this caliper, and I'm just going to tuck it over here out of the way so that we can take off that caliper bracket. Now I just have the caliper kind of just resting up here. Just make sure you're putting that in a place where it just isn't going to drop and dangle by the brake line. But these rear calipers are much lighter than the front, so that's not as critical. All right, now we can pull out the old brake pads. All right, now we need to loosen and remove these two caliper bracket bolts, and that's a 19mm socket. It's a good idea to have a hand on this bracket when you take these bolts out so that it doesn't drop to the ground. All right, now to take off this rotor, there's a few ways to do that. You know, you could just go at it with a little Tanya Harding here until it comes off. Sometimes, you know, you just give them a tap and they pop right off. But if you look closely, you'll see that there are two threaded holes in the rotor. Now what you can do is grab a couple bolts that are M8 by 1.25 and thread them into these holes. They'll act like a little force screw or press, and they'll push this rotor off of the hub. A lot of times these will get stuck or seized to the hub, especially if you live in a very rusty area. Got it. Now this one really wasn't stuck all that bad. I just wanted to show you that trick with these M8 by 1.25 bolts. Now I don't live in a very rusty area, as you can see, and so I usually just use the Tanya Harding method, just a few taps, and that will usually knock it right off. This is also called the Rotor Remover 9000. We'll pull off the old rotor. Now you can see some rust starting to build up on this hub, and what I'm going to do is clean that off and then put some anti-seize on there. Just make sure you wear some eye protection if you're using a drill with a wire wheel. Now I'm going to brush the surface of this hub with some of this anti-seize. This is from Permatex. This seems to keep that rotor from getting stuck on there. A little bit goes a long way. I'm mostly concerned with this center part here. Now we do need to wipe off the oil that the brake rotor is packed in, so just make sure you use some brake cleaner. Get that all wiped off before you put the new rotor on. When they don't want to stay on like this, sometimes I'll grab a little lug nut and just put that on. I usually only put the lug nut on if the rotors are wanting to fall off, because then you don't have to fight with it while you're putting on the caliper bracket. All right, now we need to get this bracket cleaned up and ready to go back on. And the first thing we're going to do is change out these little abutment clips or pad retainers. Just need to pry them out. Just make sure your new pads come with replacements. Sometimes they don't. All right, now before I put the new clips on, I'm just going to make sure that I clean this surface underneath here, and I'm going to use a little wire wheel with a drill. Just make sure that you do wear some safety glasses if you're going to do that. Now I do like to put just a little bit of this caliper grease underneath these clips. Now this is more of a protectant rather than a lubricant, but just a little bit of that brake grease underneath there, it seems to prevent some of the corrosion, which would cause these little clips to lift. You know, they call it rust jacking when that gets in there and that binds up really bad. More of a problem, I guess, in rustier areas, but I do it anyway. Now the new clips we have a coating on them, which will help prevent any type of corrosion as well. It'll also help the pads slide in there without getting bound up. But let's go ahead and just clip these in place. It's pretty easy. Just line them up and snap them in, just like the old ones. You just want to make sure that those are all fully seated so that you don't have any binding in your brake pads. All right, now we can take out and clean and re-grease these two slide pins. I'm going to do one side at a time. They don't feel stuck or anything, but we're just going to pull them out. Just going to wipe them off. That looks pretty good. Give them a nice little coating of this new grease here. And you see the little rubber boot just popped right back up onto it. Just make sure that these do spin freely. Sometimes I'll give them a pull and a push. Now when you push those back in, make sure that you squeeze this boot, which will push out the air. You can see right now it's pushing out a little bit, but press that in and squeeze the boot. And sometimes you'll hear a little pop. It's almost like you're burping them. As long as they move freely and smoothly, that's what you want. Same with the other one here. Now this one here has a rubber bushing on it. Now these do tend to swell and sometimes will get stuck over time. I think Toyota recommends replacing this bushing every time. You know, the kit doesn't come with it, so maybe I should just go ahead and buy some of these and have them on hand. But if it's not stuck and it's not bound up, it doesn't seem to be an issue. What I have done in the past is, you see how it has these little divots? Sometimes I'll just slice those divots a little bit deeper with a little razor blade, and that seems to prevent this from getting stuck. But this one was fine, so we'll go ahead and just clean it up, put some new grease on it, and put it back in. Okay, that looks good. That's ready to go back on. All right, now these mounting bolts for the caliper bracket, I'm gonna go ahead and just add a little bit of this medium strength blue thread locker to these bolts before I put them back in and mount that bracket. Then we just hold that bracket up while we get these started. Now, as far as the torque spec for these caliper bracket bolts, 111 is what I'm gonna go with, but I saw some people said 101 and some people said 141. I'm gonna stick with the 111 right in the middle. I think that'll be good. That's gonna be just fine for these. And I couldn't really find a conclusive number. I'm gonna go with the 111, and I did add the thread locker. I'm also not replacing these bolts. Some people say you do need to replace them and get new ones from Toyota. In my case, I didn't plan ahead and buy new bolts, and so I'm gonna go ahead and have to reuse them on this as well. Don't yell at me too bad in the comments. If you want to get new bolts for yours, that's fine. In my case, I'm just going to go ahead and reuse the same bolts that were there. They did look to be in good shape, and I think we'll be just fine doing the 111 foot-pounds. All right, now we can put in the brake pads. I just wanted to point out that we do have an inner and an outer. They're labeled from this company, Import Direct. I just picked these up at my local O'Reilly. And they also came with these little clips here on the end of the pads. These usually will go on the top of the pad, but the ones that I took off didn't have them. I'm gonna use them, just clip them on right there, and that will help hold that pad in place. So we can go ahead and put in the inner pad. Just line that up and kind of just sometimes have to press on those. See here, I'm gonna push down on that clip. There we go. All right, well, I'm stopping the video right here because I made a pretty obvious mistake. And of course, I was talking about how you need to put the inside pad on the inside and the outside pad on the outside, and I ended up doing it wrong. I was just focused on the video and talking and explaining everything, and I completely spaced out. But I put the inside pad on the outside and the outside pad on the inside. Now, of course, I didn't notice this until reviewing this footage and making this video. So I'm gonna take the caliper back off, swap those pads, and then we'll continue with the rest of the video. Now, on most vehicles, it doesn't matter what side the brake pad goes on the inside or the outside. Some GM trucks, you know, they do have a slightly different design of the pad, but they look different. On this one, they look identical, but I guess it's the friction material that's different. It's a slightly different compound on the inside versus the outside, and that's designed to help the pads wear evenly. You know, that wasn't a call I wanted to make to let the owner know that I had made a mistake, but they completely understood, and I just told them, just bring it on over, it won't take me long at all. And that's what I'm doing right now, is just swapping out the inside and the outside pads, and this now should be good to go. And here's the outer pad, same thing, just gonna put that little clip on the top, right there, and just bring this around, line it up, and push it on. Now, I also like to use this silicone ceramic brake parts lubricant. You know, it's an extreme temperature, so we can put this on the outside. Even though these shims here are rubberized, it just seems to keep these a little bit quieter by dampening the vibrations, which can cause noise. Really doesn't take much, just a few little dabs where the caliper will make contact. And we'll do this side here as well, where the piston is going to make contact. All right, now before I put this caliper bracket on, you see right here our boot is pushed out a little bit. Sometimes you can just massage those back down with your fingers, but other times you'll need to grab a little pick or a little mini pry bar and just pull the rubber boot outward away from the piston because there's trapped air in there. There we go. You can almost hear the little air escape as I did that, and then it just settled right back down where it's supposed to go. And then I'm just gonna clean the caliper a little bit with a brush, just knock off any of this debris that's on there. All right, and then we can bring the caliper back over the pads like so. Just line that up carefully. All right, and then we can put in the caliper slide pin bolts. Now, keep in mind, sometimes when you put this caliper on, you might have to pull in a little bit on those slide pins. And then when you're putting these bolts back in, sometimes you just have to lift up a little bit on that caliper to get these started. You can see that that slide pin just wants to spin now, even as I'm just turning that in by hand. So in order to torque this, we're gonna grab that same 17 millimeter open end wrench and a 14 millimeter here on a torque wrench. This is the gear wrench 85062. I'm gonna go ahead and torque this to 25 foot-pounds. All right, now we can put the little parking brake motor back on. Just line that up. Make sure your connector's out of the way. And just give it a little twist as you push that on. That O-ring felt like it was in good shape, and then all we need to do is put these little Allen bolts back in. Now don't get too carried away with these little Allen bolts, but just make them snug. All right, and then we can reconnect the parking brake motor. And let's pull this lug nut back off so we don't forget. Done that a few times. And you're done. Now it's very important that when you're done with both sides that you step on the brake pedal, which will push this caliper piston back out, pressing those pads up against the rotor where they need to be. When you do that, don't press the pedal all the way to the floor. That can damage the seals in the master cylinder. Just press it down about halfway several times until it feels firm, and then you can double check the fluid level on the master cylinder as well. Now, as far as the electronic parking brake, it will automatically adjust. The first time that you apply it, you're gonna hear it run a lot longer than normal as it's pushing itself all the way out, but you don't need to reset anything. You shouldn't have any check engine lights or codes or anything like that. This is good to go. I hope you liked the video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you don't mind. That does help me out. I'll get a link in the description to some of the parts and tools used in the video as well. Thanks so much for watching, and good luck.